For those of you whom I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Ron Daniels, and it's my great privilege to serve as the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University. I want to start by welcoming our distinguished guests, our colleagues from more than 30 academic institutions, including Senator, now Professor Barbara Mikulski. Senator slash professor, is that the right order, or is it now professor slash? Okay, I like that. She calls me boss. We all know better, of course. And of course, you'll know that Professor Mikulski has made the switch from government to academe, and of course, thrilled to be able to welcome civic leaders from across the country, including our own Mayor Catherine Pugh. And to all of you bringing your ideas and experience to the second annual symposium of our 21st Century Cities Initiative. Many thanks to Kathy Eden, Ben Siegel, and all of your colleagues at the 21st Century Cities Initiative and GovX for bringing us together. The group assembled here is truly testament to the amalgam of experiences, viewpoints, and talents necessary to make a lasting and meaningful impact in our cities. Impact that requires us to identify and amplify our city's strengths, even as we seek to address the complex challenges facing so many of our urban centers in America today. I know that your time here will be spent digging in on exactly how you do that in cities across the nation, including, of course, our own. So allow me, in addition to welcoming you, to offer a few thoughts grounded in our experience here, both in Baltimore and at Johns Hopkins, that hopefully will resonate more broadly in your conversations here today. Now, I'm in the 9th year of my presidency here at Johns Hopkins, and a presidency that at least I have very deliberately sought to make, and indeed to define very much around the role of Johns Hopkins in the city of Baltimore. As an institution whose history and present is inextricably linked to the city we have called home for over 140 years, we have a sense of responsibility as an anchor institution in the city. And although our record is not unblemished, we are firmly committed to harnessing our intellectual, moral, financial, and convening capabilities for the betterment of the city. And this is captured for me in a phrase that I've oft repeated, and one that only becomes truer with time, and that is that Johns Hopkins is not just in or at, but truly of this city. And this is manifest in a myriad of ways through our ongoing partnerships with many stakeholders, including a number of you who are in this room. It's evident in the longstanding partnerships with Baltimore City Schools to create and sustain new programming, including our first cohort of students attending an innovative high school to jobs pipeline program based in one of the most challenged neighborhoods in our city. That's the P-TECH program. It has formed the basis of our collaborations with community, civic, and business leaders to strengthen neighborhoods through the launch of real estate development funds for projects that would not receive support from traditional sources, to the operation of a new public school, the first school to have been built in East Baltimore in over 25 years, and the creation of a new park and housing as part of a landmark development project in East Baltimore. And it has spurred the creation and expansion of our economic inclusion program, Be Local, a network of 25 area institutions that have set goals to increase their commitments to build, buy, and hire locally. But for as long as I have been here, and indeed long before, the narrative of Baltimore has been one of contradiction, of paradox. One that boasts of tremendous and really inspiring green shoots of creativity, like the growth of new businesses from tech-based startups like the cancer diagnostics firm started by 2 Hopkins doctors, PGDX, which recently received $65 million in an ongoing equity funding round, to family and neighborhood businesses that found support through the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses Program, and has now established a permanent site here in Baltimore, and very much drawn by the wealth of local talent. This is one narrative of Baltimore that we're inspired by and excited by and encouraged by. But of course, there's another narrative that is equally compelling, equally legitimate, and it's a story of a city in the grip of simply devastating state of deep poverty, ill health, joblessness, despair, and of course, violence. It is this latter issue of violence and crime, of course, is the dark cloud that hovers over us and which extracts a tragic toll on so many of our fellow citizens who are living in unimaginable conditions of violence that crush our children and their families' futures. So, where do we go from here with these two different and equally compelling legitimate narratives? A question I'm sure in your own context and perhaps focus on different, though perhaps similarly daunting challenges bring so many of you here today. First, I have to say that although I am undoubtedly biased, I have to declare my full confidence and support for the city of Baltimore, as I know you would for your cities. Baltimore is chock-a-block with possibility. We have so many truly distinct and enviable advantages. Our proximity to DC and the Eastern Seaboard, our roll call of strong anchor institutions, including academic research institutions and medical centers, great national foundations like Annie Casey, Weinberg, Abel, and increasingly Bloomberg Philanthropies, businesses like BGE, Under Armour, M&T Bank, and T. Rowe Price, and amazing cultural institutions like the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, Center Stage Theater, and the Maryland Film Festival, all of whom are fiercely devoted to the possibilities of the city. So that's one part that I think is an important response to how we think about this, as a sense of optimism and hopefulness about where we can end up. Second, I think we can take heart from the lessons of other cities that have suffered the tipping of health to dysfunction, but significantly the tipping back from dysfunction to health again. Though scholars have not come to a consensus or why and how in ink-distinct local this happens, there is evidence, including historic reductions of crime in our own city, that crime is indeed soluble. And although one has to be attentive to root causes, good, strong policing and prosecution, effective coordination and active collaboration among all stakeholders and systems that touch on criminal justice can create the conditions for other interventions to work and lift the city. And we know that we create a bedrock of safety and well-being that allows residents to thrive. We also seed the ground for further investment and inward migration in the city. In short, we do not have to endure these endless cycles of bloodshed, despair, and disinvestment. And third and most important, I think, is the role of leadership. Now, in my previous life as a law professor, I would often interact with students around the design of good policies and institutions and how they can change outcomes, how they can change human behavior. When I lectured on the issue of how governments in both the developed and developing world were able to adopt policies that improve materially the lives of their citizens, students often press me on the balance among different components and what it explains to tip a city or a nation towards a better future. Is it culture? Is it resources? Is it innate traditions? And the answer, of course, is yes to all. And I'd pause here to say that a key component to success is the ability to draw on the kind of applied research and data-driven analysis that so many of you are engaged in and that lies at the core of the work of the 21st Century Cities Initiative and GovX. Research that matches faculty capacity with the policy and practice needs of city and community partners and allow them to understand the impact and effectiveness of interventions, policies, and programs as they unfold. But in truth, the most important, I think, component in explaining how you tip from dysfunction to health is leadership. And that is true across so many institutions, but I think it is particularly true in the context of our cities. The willingness to be single-mindedly focused on what needs to be done, to be able to articulate clearly and boldly the challenges we confront, and then to lay out a way forward to overcome them, to assemble a high-performance team, and then to set goals and insist on accountabilities, and to be able to rally, to inspire other leaders and key stakeholders around this vision. This is, to me, this is for so many of us, the margin of possibility that lifts our hopes for the communities of which we're a part. And in our mayor, we have that. In her recent and quite extraordinary and bold commitment to enhance recruitment into the police force in order to restore the force to full strength. In her commitment to the Safe Streets program and to working with partners to disrupt the cycle of poverty and incarceration that robs young people of their futures. And in her equal commitment to partnering with all of us to answer the calls for jobs and economic opportunity and better education, not just for some, but indeed for all our neighbors. For all these reasons, I am pleased to be able to introduce to you Baltimore's great mayor, Catherine Pugh, to offer a few thoughts. And I should just say, just before she starts speaking, if at some point, as she finishes her remarks, I dash out of here, it is only because at 9:30 I have a meeting with the mayor that I'm ill prepped for, and so I want to make sure that that I am able to carry my own in that conversation in just about a half hour's time. But I know, Mayor, it's polite and smart that if I'm going to have a conversation with you, I should at least stay for your remarks. I will do that. So please apologize if I leave. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. First, let me, on behalf of all of the citizens of Baltimore, welcome you to our great city. And I just have to say to Ron Daniels, first of all, thank you for being such a great partner. And it is so important that you have great partners in this work. You know, I think part of the conversations that you all will have today is how do you go from advocacy to policymaking to leading a city, and how do you make sure that 21st century tools are in place so that the transformation that you would like to see take place does so. And I am so grateful to Johns Hopkins, GovX, and being a Bloomberg city for all that they have done for me personally, just in terms of enlightening me how I push my vision forward, but more importantly, how to create a staff of individuals around you who will help to carry out your vision and also are able to reach beyond City Hall to enact policies and so forth that are necessary, and then the collaboration piece that is so important to moving cities forward. I always think that, Ron, I don't know if you know this, but tomorrow, December the 6th, is my 1-year anniversary as mayor of this great city, Baltimore. You know, whenever I sit down with a group of folks, whether they're young, old, middle income, poor, wealthy, business people, social workers, community activists, I always say, I did not come into City Hall without knowledge of the problems that our city was facing. And I realized that it meant that I'd had to change the cultural behavior of city government, that I would have to understand the resources that were available to me. And I was listening to Senator Barbara Mikulski this morning, and we were talking about how this current, I guess we could say administration or folks in Washington, D.C., you know, regime is looking at changing, you know, tax structure, changing social programs, and what we have to do, and I really loved what you said, Senator Mikulski, we have to reimagine what we can do with what we have. And so that means, how do you create additional partnerships? How do you reimagine the programs that you have in place? And one of the things that Bloomberg Philanthropies and GovX has taught me is that everything is measurable. But the other side of that is never be afraid to try new things with the resources that you have. And I realized when I came into this position that I was facing a myriad of problems. But I say to folks that you have to make a decision. Are you going to make decisions that look like you're solving things immediately, or are you going to create solutions that will be long-lasting? And for me, it was about creating long-lasting solutions and understanding the poverty that exists in our city, the wealth that exists in our city, and the communities that could assist us in moving our city forward. You know, one of the things that I did immediately as the mayor of the city was to say to the public, I called it a call to action, that I can't do this work by myself. And so I called in community leaders, folks that you would not ordinarily look at in terms of the philanthropy community and folks that you would support, but people in the neighborhoods and communities that were on the ground. And I can tell you that every other week in City Hall, we meet in City Hall about 30 or 40 community groups talking about, or community leaders as I would call them, advocates on how we change the paradigms that are facing Baltimore. I believe that solutions must be evidence-based, that racial equality and inclusion is important, and community redevelopment in our city is something that we must focus on. And then understanding the power of the mayor. And I don't mean power for power's sake. I mean, for example, when you chair a finance board for your city, understand your role as the chair of that board. For example, Senator Mikulski, I walked into my first finance board meeting and everybody turned around and looked at me, and I asked the comptroller what was the issue. She said, even though you sit as the chair of that board, no mayor has ever attended that board in the 21 years that I've been here. But let me just say, this is the kind of thing that comes before us. And this is something I wanted to share. We were doing our bonding for the future, and I looked at community development, and then I looked at affordable housing. And I said to the group, because they had $6 million on the table for affordable housing, I said, well, how long has it been that way? And they said for the last few years. I said, well, take $4 million out of that particular pocket and put it over here in affordable housing, which changed the paradigm for our city moving forward, moving that to $10 million because we need affordable housing in our city. When I looked at the problems of crime that we're facing in our city, I said, we've got to do something different. And so not just looking at the technology and so forth, and I'm thankful to Bloomberg Philanthropies because we just received a grant for $5 million for the technology needs of our police department. But I said, we have to look at it from the perspective of how do we solve the underlying problems. For example, 17 to 24-year-olds who are focused on, who are creating some of the criminal problems that our city is facing. So there was a commitment for $10 million, I believe it was, from the state to focus on how do we deal with those particular individuals. And this was before I was elected. And when I found out that that commitment was no longer there, I didn't sit on the sideline and talk about what do we need to do. I partnered with the business community and said, help me raise that money because this is a program that this city must have because we've got to hire individuals. We've got to find out what their problems are, and we've got to work with them to solve those issues so that they don't become repeat offenders in our community. You cannot be afraid to try new programs. And so the other issue around solving that problem was bringing all of our agencies together. Because I tell folks collaboration is really important. And so instead of you sitting in your office in housing and you sitting in your office in the health department or the liquor board or all of these things, we brought everybody together with the police department. So every day at 8 a.m. they're meeting together. And what we found, again, using evidence-based technology, measuring everything, that we've gone from solving a problem from 14 to 20 days to 1.5 days. And then I walked into the police department and I said, how can we get more police officers on our streets? Because we had frozen police positions in our city for 2 years. And do the math. An attrition rate of 20 to 25 police officers leaving every month. That's 300 police officers a year, 600 police officers. And so I was at a position that I had to step up hiring police officers for our city. And so I said, well, now I can't change the 10.5 months. And this is why it's important that you take advantage of all the tools that Bloomberg Philanthropies and GovX provides for you. We have a Bloomberg team. And so I said, we can't change the 10.5 months, so I need you to focus on what does it take to become a police officer. What we found was that that was a 9-month process. Using my Bloomberg team, we have now cut that down to a 4-month process. You can't police your way out of crime problems, but your city must have a police force to meet the needs of your community. But then the other thing that is really important to us, and this is why I say you can't be afraid to try new things. When I looked at the unemployment issue in our city, I woke up one morning at 4 a.m., which is what I do every day, and I thought I would call one of my partners in the public sector, in the private sector, and I said, well, maybe I'll wait till about 6:30 a.m. And so I called up the head of one of our corporations and I said, you know, I have this idea. I talked about it when I was campaigning. We need to go out to the neighborhoods, out to the communities, and help people get jobs. And with today's technology, can't we do that with mobile units, going out to those neighborhoods, out to those communities? And I can tell you, we have about a 5% unemployment rate in Baltimore because we were not afraid to try something different. And now we've got the Office of Employment Development out on the streets, knocking on doors, you know, with shirts saying, need a job, ask me. We've got to be creative in the way that we deal with the resources that we have, and more importantly, be able to partner with the private sector. So I know that there are going to be great conversations had here this morning. I want to welcome all those mayors that are here in Baltimore. Thank you for being here. More importantly, I hope that you will find these conversations worthwhile. I hope that you will take back some of these suggestions and implement them. I hope you will take advantage of what GovX offers, and those of you who are Bloomberg cities, I hope that you will not be afraid to try new things and understand that the community depends on you. The business community will listen to you. Your philanthropic communities will listen to you if you have evidence that shows that what you're doing can work, whether it is in your city or some other city, because one of the things that we consistently look at is what are best practices and who's doing best what we want to do. Thank you all for being here. Again, welcome to Baltimore.
I hope you can get a sense of how truly fortunate we are here in Baltimore. Mayor Pugh, we can feel your passion and your tenacity, and President Daniels, his support for the 21st Century Cities Initiative and and under its umbrella, the Center for Government Excellence, GovX, has just been remarkable. So I'm Kathy Eden. I am the faculty director of 21CC, and I'm here to welcome you. We're only 3 years old as an initiative. Last year was our inaugural symposium, and I have to admit to you, it was an experiment. You know, as we thought about what it was we wanted to create, we identified a crucial hole in policymaking. Scholars who wanted to affect policy were mostly all focused on the federal level. But everything interesting that was going on was happening at the local level. So our bold goal was to help fill that goal by creating truly synergistic partnerships between cities and researchers that would move both enterprises forward. So we brought you all together. On the city side, we had people from housing, economic development, education, public safety, criminal justice, health. On the academic side, we had sociologists, economists, political scientists, data scientists, health researchers. We had students, and we have quite a few students here today: Isaac, Paige, Phil, Micaiah, Elizabeth. What came of last year's symposium, I think, was really amazing. We had a series of conversations about policy problems informed by research and by researchers learning what policy levers, policy makers had at hand. And really what resulted was a magical alchemy. And I think on both sides we came away with truly new ideas. So after this experiment, we came up with a tagline for the symposium, and that tagline's really stuck. So 3 words: research, leadership, and transformation. How do we combine these 3 things to make cities true hubs of inclusion, opportunity, and innovation? And that's why we're here today, to do that again, but with a little experience under our belt. Today we're going to present some very exciting new research from Paul Jargowski and Patrick Sharkey. And we're going to introduce that research to you in conversation with city leaders. So that constitutes the morning panels. After a very exciting noon panel, we're going to break into workshops. In fact, these workshops are so exciting, I can't decide which I am going to attend. Just as one teaser, the Darity Hamilton team is going to share findings of their brand new study on the racial wealth gap here in Baltimore. But I know that each of these sessions will be incredible. So ask tough questions, talk to a mayor or a researcher, make a connection across that divide, and challenge yourself to take away something that you can apply to your daily work. And now I want to introduce the person who is really responsible for virtually everything you see here today, our Executive Director, Ben Siegel.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. All right, that was pretty good for early in the morning. So we've got a packed agenda today, and what I wanted to do coming up here is to walk you through it a little bit. I'm going to walk through our program quickly, and then we're going to dive right into our first panel. But, you know, before I jump in today, I just need to acknowledge the amazing conversation we had last night with a dynamic group of new mayors. Some of you were here for that. We had this panel of 4 mayors who have come into office recently from every corner of the country. Mayor Richard Irvin from Aurora, Illinois, Mayor Asia Brown from Compton, California, Mayor Chokwe Lumumba from Jackson, Mississippi, and Mayor LeVar Stoney from Richmond, Virginia. And they really set the tone for today. Our 21cc steering committee member, Lester Spence, moderated an amazing conversation with them that touched on issues of economic segregation and inclusion, issues of community and law enforcement relationships, issues of preemption, issues of inclusive revitalization, public-private partnerships, many of the things that Ron and the mayor just touched on. And you know, these mayors, I don't want to give away their ages, but some of them are not eligible to be president. And it was so amazing, not just their leadership, but it just gave you a lot of hope for the future of our country, that we have amazing leaders all across of the country. And so that was great. And, you know, our room, we were in the Baltimore ballroom, it was figuratively just on fire last night. And for those of you who stayed in the hotel, you might have seen at about 1 a.m., like 5 fire trucks pulled up to the front of the building. And I like came running downstairs. I thought maybe the room really was on fire, but I think it was okay. So what I wanted to do right now is walk you through our agenda. As I mentioned, it's packed, and there's some confusing parts to it, so I want to make sure you're good with it. And I should also note, we've got our staff around the room. They've got on their badges, it mentions staff. You can ask them questions. Find me, ask a question if you get confused on anything. But here's the thing. So all of you hopefully got your agenda in your bags or when you came in. This will be a good guide for you throughout the day. So the first thing, the way that the day is going to work, this morning, we are going to have in this room our 2 plenary panels. And so after I get started here, we'll call up our first panel. Each of the plenaries will be about 90 minutes, give or take. We're already off schedule a little bit, but don't worry, we'll catch up. And we're going to have these panels as conversations. We're going to have Q&A built into them. So as you're listening, think of some good, tough questions. And then following our second panel, we all have to clear the room. So we'll get a break. We'll take a short break between our first and second panel where we can hang out in the room. But following our second panel, we all have to clear the room, grab some water, you know, catch up on email and phone calls. We'll come back in for a plated luncheon, and we have to clear the room so that they can get the lunch set up. So we just ask after the second panel, and I'll come back and remind everyone, just clear your things off the table. You can leave your things on your chair. They're going to do the plated lunch. Then we're going to have an amazing luncheon panel on the issues of preemption and super preemption that many cities are dealing with. And then following the luncheon, we're going to break and then go into our afternoon workshops. Now, this is probably the most confusing part of our symposium. So on the back of your name badges, you all have 2 little circle stickers on the left and the right. They have numbers on them. They indicate the workshop track that you've been assigned to. And in the agenda, you can see which number gets connected to which room. And again, we'll help people kind of navigate that. But there's 2 tracks, early in the afternoon, then later in the afternoon. The sticker on the left is for the early afternoon one. The sticker on the right is for the late afternoon one. Now, I say all that with also saying, we're not going to be like super sticklers here. If you change your mind and you want to go to a different workshop, that's okay. But many of you, most of you, when you registered, you filled out our survey and you selected the workshops you wanted. So we've tried to match you up as best as we could with your selections. But with that said, if you go to a different workshop, go for it, by all means. We just ask that you try to stay in the same room for the whole workshop rather than moving all around. And the workshops are intended to be extremely interactive, so we want you to come to the workshops with good ideas, questions, and all of that. Okay, so that's the agenda again. Ask our staff if you have any questions. The other thing I want to touch on is our website. On the screens here, we're going to have a couple slides this morning. And we're going to have some other materials on the website. It might be hard to see this in the back. If you've got your laptop or your phone, you can pull up the address. It's 21stcenturyneighborhoods.org. 21stcenturyneighborhoods.org. And on our homepage of that symposium website, I know it's a little tricky, even hard to do on a phone, but 21stcenturyneighborhoods.org, we will have the entire slides from this morning and all of the workshop slides. And when we get into the first panel, Paul Jarkowski has put together an amazing set of 264 graphs of economic segregation in metro areas. They're all on the website, so you can kind of peruse through them. And all of our background materials are on there as well. So please use the website. The other thing is, we're not doing full bios of all the speakers, but if you go to the website, you can go to speaker bios links, and you can read them as you're listening to folks. And then finally, for all of your tweets that I know you'll be sending out all day, our hashtag is 21cc Symposium. And again, all of this is on the cover of the program. Hopefully everyone can connect to Wi-Fi. The password and everything is on the back of your badges. So finally, before we jump in, I just wanted to pick up on something that Ron had mentioned. We've got about 350 people here. And it's really an amazing group. And I want to leave you with just a couple of the stats of who's here. We have representatives from 48 cities from across the country. And as Ron had mentioned, yeah, we can give that an applause. It's a mix. We have some mayors, we have some housing directors, we have some economic development folks, we have some public safety folks, we have health folks, we've got really across the board criminal justice folks and the rest. We have urban scholars from 32 universities from across the country. And we have representatives from 90 nonprofit organizations. And that includes research organizations, it includes advocacy organizations, it includes philanthropies, it includes community and faith-based organizations, direct service organizations, all working on the issues that we're talking about today. And of course, we've got our private sector. We've got about 30 private sector companies in the room, so thank you for being here as well. So what I want to leave you with is, I just want to give a shout out to our steering committee at the 21st Century Cities Initiative. You know, our initiative is very connected across the 10 divisions of Johns Hopkins. We have 10 schools, 10 divisions, and we have faculty steering committee members representing each of those schools. And I think most of our steering committee is here today. They also have little red indicators on their badges that they're on our steering committee. And they're the real juice to our initiative and helping to pull together faculty and researchers from across the university who we can then partner up with Baltimore and with other cities and nonprofits and others to do applied research that can really help us move some of these policies that we're going to be talking about today forward. So steering committee, thank you for that. So without further ado, I'm going to call up our first panel. We're going to do a little bit of stage management here, but Marisol and panel, come on up and we'll get you situated and we're going to jump right into it. So stay in your seats and we're going to get going. So thank you, everyone.
All right, good morning, everyone. How are you? My name is Marisol Bello, and I'm the Director of Content Strategy and Development for the Center for Community Change, and I'm super excited to be here today. We are going to be digging in for 90 minutes on some new trends, research, policy problems, policy solutions around economic segregation and inequality. You know, when we think about inequality, we always often in the media, we talk about it in a kind of very 30,000-foot view. And as Kathy pointed out in her intro, you know, a lot of the really interesting stuff is happening locally. And so with this great panel, we're hoping to be able to dig in on what folks are seeing and some of the ways that they're trying to work around it. I'll introduce the panel. Here to my right is Paul Dragowski, and he's a professor of public policy at Rutgers University, and he's going to talk to us about some new exciting research that he's done into inequality and economic segregation. And next to him is the Honorable Ross Baraka, who is the mayor of Newark. Next to him is Eric Sullivan, excuse me, I'm so sorry, Sullivan, who's the executive director of the Office of Housing and Opportunities for People Everywhere in the city of Denver. Michael McAfee, the president of Policy Link, and former U.S. Senator Barbara Mikulski, who is now the Homewood Professor of Public Policy at Johns Hopkins. So we're really excited to talk about some big issues that are affecting everyone's cities. First, we'll start with Paul. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your research and outline some of the trends and findings, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Ben and Kathy and everybody for inviting me. It's one thing to sit in my office and do a lot of research, but to know that there are people out there who actually can learn from what I've done and maybe teach me a few things about how these cities work and how these neighborhoods work. It's a great opportunity, and I really appreciate it. So there's been a lot of talk about inequality, and we have heard more about inequality in the last few years than I ever expected we would. It's become a very important issue and an issue that emerged rather dramatically in the national conversation. But a lot of the effects of inequality, a lot of the reasons that we worry about inequality are due to inequality when it is expressed in neighborhoods. So you could have a lot of inequality, but you could still have a lot of equal neighborhoods because people could be mixed together in different kinds of housing within neighborhoods. But it turns out, of course, that people are highly segregated by income, so that in addition to there being a lot of inequality, we have very unequal neighborhoods. And this is where you have a lot of problems that emerge. First of all, just with the effects on children. And you know, there's the dramatic research that has come out of Raj Chetty and his colleagues, first at Harvard, he's now at Stanford, showing the really large long-term effects on kids who grow up in high-poverty neighborhoods. And of course, we know about high-poverty neighborhoods that generate, that end up being plagued by crime and violence. And there are health effects of living in high-poverty neighborhoods. And all of these things have dramatic, really harmful effects on people who are having to reside in these kinds of places. So I also think that people don't necessarily fully appreciate, though, that those costs aren't limited to people who live in those neighborhoods. When you have children who are not learning as well as they could, who are becoming workers, and they're not as productive as they might be, that causes slows down economic growth in the entire metropolitan area. When you have crime and violence issues that lead to more costs for incarceration and policing, those taxes are paid by everybody in the metropolitan area to fund those kinds of systems. When you have poor health, that's also ultimately paid through Medicaid or through uncompensated care in hospitals that, again, everybody in the metropolitan area is subject to these kinds of costs. So it's very important. And so what I've worked with Chris Wheeler, who is also in the audience and who has been warned that any hard questions I will send to him. But what we've done is we tried to get a really good picture of, in our nation's metropolitan areas across many decades, from 1970 to 2010, how have people become more segregated by income? And that's reflected which of course results in these highly unequal neighborhoods. if we could go to the first slide, there's two lines on this chart, but there's a ton of data behind these two lines. So let me just explain it a little bit. The blue line, the lower line, is something called the Gini Coefficient, and that is a measurement of inequality. And essentially, if every family had about the same income, that would be zero. But if every family had one family had all the income, it would be 1. And this is showing the Gini coefficient, the blue line, for individual households relative to 1970. And as you can see, it's been increasing a lot. It goes up about, we've got about 13% increase in the Gini coefficient. And this is an average across 264 metropolitan areas. It was all the places I could track consistently over time from 1970 to 2010. It's that you can measure inequality lots of ways, and Chris and I have done that, and you see the same, regardless of the measure you use, you see a lot of increase in inequality in metropolitan areas. Just one thing that I think is really indicative of that, in the average metropolitan area, the bottom 20% of the households, their share of total income declined by 8%. Second 20%, which is kind of like the working class group, their income of that, the share of income from that group had declined 18%. Okay? In fact, the bottom 4/5 of all households experienced a decline in the share of income that they were enjoying, whereas the top 20%, their share of total income increased by 11%. In fact, it reached, in the 2010 data, it reached 50%. So 50% of all the income in these metropolitan areas was going to the top 20% of the households. So there's more inequality, and you knew that, you've heard that from other sources. It's a national trend, and it's also replicated in these individual metropolitan areas. Then what I also did, though, however, is to look at the same measure, the Gini coefficient, and apply it to the neighborhoods. And that's the red line. And what you see there is that the red line was increasing much faster than the blue line. So neighborhoods became more unequal at a faster rate than households. So we know that, yeah, okay, there's more inequality, so of course neighborhoods are going to look a little more unequal. But in fact, it's not just that, it's that people are sorting out even more than they were. So it's because, in effect, one measurement of economic segregation is essentially the ratio of the Gini coefficient for neighborhoods to the Gini coefficient for households. And so that is when the neighborhoods are becoming more unequal faster, that means economic segregation is increasing. So using that kind of a measure, I looked at economic segregation in these 264 metropolitan areas. In the next slide, you can see that these are the 25 largest metropolitan areas, and essentially every one of them except Nassau, Suffolk, which is sort of a weird place, every one of them showed a fairly large increase in economic segregation over time. And they started at different levels, but this was a fairly ubiquitous trend in metropolitan areas that they were all seeing more economic segregation. That means that all of them are going to be subject to all these costs and difficulties. And essentially that in these metropolitan areas, every social problem that you'd like to solve is harder to solve when you have more economic segregation, and all of them, with that one exception I mentioned, had more economic segregation, and quite a lot more in many cases, as you can see. Now there are a few places that didn't. If you noticed, Denver and Minneapolis, there's either no change or a very small change in economic segregation from 1970 to 2010. So if we could go to the next slide, this shows basically the two different patterns that I see in the data. And one is represented by the two metropolitan areas on the left, and that is the more common pattern, and that is that neighborhoods became unequal much faster than households. So not only was there more inequality to start with, people were sorted out a lot more. Whereas you have the two cities on the right, where we have Minneapolis and we have Denver, and you see, yeah, there was more inequality in neighborhoods in those two places. And the reason was there was more inequality in the households. but they didn't sort out more. Whatever they were doing in those two places, they had more inequality in households, but probably because of the national trends, the international trends, globalization, a lot of things that are not really fully under the control of mayors and local policymakers. But the stuff that they had control over, which is how do neighborhoods form, where is housing built, those kinds of things, in those two places, it seems as if they were doing something right. And that and so that they had more unequal neighborhoods only because there was more inequality to begin with. And they were, at least, they were not making it worse by the way the cities were developing and growing. And so that to me suggests we really have to look at what things local policymakers can do to try to counterbalance and offset the income inequality at the household level that's driven by factors, factors that are in some cases out of the control of local policymakers. Chris and I worked on case studies of various metropolitan areas. And two of the things that just jumped out from those case studies were that places where the new housing construction was disproportionately in the suburbs are places that had more economic segregation over time. And places where the income differential was growing faster between the central cities and the suburbs also had more inequality over time, which suggests that since that there are ways to combat increasing inequality of neighborhoods by having housing construction be balanced. And you shouldn't have certain parts of the area that are growing much faster than is needed to accommodate population growth. When you do that, when some areas are growing much faster than is really needed for population growth, it's just sort of logical that what they're doing is cannibalizing the older places, and the central cities and the inner ring suburbs. So we've had cannibalistic growth in a lot of the suburbs. And the second thing, and this applies to gentrifying neighborhoods in the inner city as well, is that every area that's growing should be building housing that accommodates, that includes affordable housing that accommodates everybody in the income distribution, so that people aren't forced to segregate by where housing is located. So I know that I'm anxious to hear more about Newark, where I think you're trying to preserve, in gentrifying neighborhoods, preserve affordable housing. I'm really anxious to hear more about Denver, because there are things local policymakers can do to stem this tide towards economic segregation. There are some things that local policymakers can do to address inequality generally among the households. I mean, for example, the $15 minimum wage would be one thing that could be done locally that would affect the income distribution in those communities. But by and large, the real leverage that local policymakers is going to have is going to be, how are these places developing? What kind of housing is being built? Where is it being built? And can people access those neighborhoods? And I think that this meeting will be helpful to figuring out better ways to address those questions. Thank you.
That's great. That's a great primer. Thank you so much, Paul. Mm-hmm. You know, we can actually, you kind of gave us a good segue to jump into how this all applies in the real world. Mayor Baraka, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've been seeing in Newark. Like many older northeastern cities, you've been hit with some depopulation and some increasing economic segregation over the last 40 years. Maybe you can talk about some of the key factors that you've experienced in your city.
Well, thank you for that. But you know, I think that these issues are decades old, right? So it's not just economic segregation, it's also racial segregation, right? So these things are intertwined, and obviously, you know, because we live in a system that has concentrated wealth in the hands of a few people, and it's also a racist society. We've segregated people based on the color of their skin, the language, the background, and so there are places that are not just segregated by class, they're also segregated by race, and it's been this way for at least 5 decades or more in the city where I live, in the city of Newark, after migration from the South to the cities, and then you have people who have gotten a little money and begin to move out of Newark into the suburbs. But you know, that was subsidized by the government, by the way, during and after World War II. So the segregation in our communities has been systemic. It's been driven by policy, right? So not just by happenstance or just by accident. It's been like a deliberate kind of push to put people out of these cities into the suburbs, kind of developing suburban economy where the wealth comes from the city, but people leave out of the cities and take the wealth from the cities and go to the suburbs. The trend is reversing, by the way. So a lot of these cities are beginning to gain population, like Newark. Newark is gaining population because millennials are beginning to say they don't want to live in the suburbs anymore. They want to live next to trains. They want to be able to walk. They want to be able to live downtown. They want to do all these kind of things. So they want to move into these cities, and that's what's happening. So not only are we experiencing a population growth, but you're experiencing economic growth. So we have over $3 billion worth of development happening in and around the downtown area that previously didn't happen, because it is ironic that he uses the red line, because it was a red line that was drawn around the entire city.
That's right. That
stopped people from investing in these communities. And so those things are changing, and it has not expanded to the whole city. It's still, there's growth happening. We have to force it manually to take place outside of the downtown area. And what we've done is we've just passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which forces developers who develop not just new housing, but remodel old buildings, that they have to put a percentage of that housing has to be for workforce and low-income residents at the same time. We also put a caveat in it that, because they complain that they're not making enough money fast enough, but that they can invest not just in other parts of the city at their whim. They have to have a discussion with city officials. We've even allowed them to identify areas of a city that has been that have been disinvested in for very long periods of time, that has abandoned buildings, abandoned properties. For example, if you pick 6 or 7 of these abandoned housing, if you remodel it, if you fix it, if you develop it, and you have to sell it at cost, the amount of money you invested in it is the amount of money you can sell it at to workforce folks that are living in the community. We will accept that as well. So we're becoming very innovative about how we capture the wealth that's coming into the city and redistribute it so that it is, other people can get a piece of it at the same time. And the last piece we have is something called Newark 2020, which we are telling all of the anchor institutions that they have to hire at least 2,020 Newark residents by the year 2020. We've identified at least 30 to 40 anchor institutions, and positively enough, a lot of those organizations are agreeing to move forward, from universities to the corporate sector to the med community, who are saying, listen, we understand that, because right now only 18% of the jobs that are held by Newark residents in these anchor institutions, and 60% of those 18% of those jobs are held by white Americans. So we are beginning to force them to see this, and they are partnering with us to begin to say we're going to hire Newark residents, but also invest in Newark small businesses so they can also hire people and expand at the same time. There's a lot of work to do. I know it sounds like a great thing, but we are at the bottom of that, and there's a lot of work to do along that line. And there's a lot of work to do to desegregate, these cities and these communities, and desegregate them economically first, and then desegregate them racially.
And so you have to be very intentional in how you are approaching everything, particularly as demographics change. Right?
You have to be intentional, because it was intentional how it got this way. So we have to be very deliberate and focused about. And I just want to say one last piece, and really this is like counterintuitive to growth in the state and the country, because we have whole groups of people that are not in the labor market, right? You have whole groups of people that are not in the economy, that are not contributing to the economy, that are not contributing to the GDP, that, by the way, is created mostly in the cities now, that are not contributing to any of these things, which is keeping the metro area where I live, the market, stagnant, right? There's no real growth, no real innovation. There's a new study that just came out about the many black and brown young people who are testing high in terms of innovation and invention, who are not getting the opportunity to move into those fields at the same time. So there are hundreds of thousands, even millions of people across the tri-state area who are not allowed to be in the economy who are forced, that's forcing this country not to just stay still, because science says a body, that not everything is always in motion, right? So it's either going forward or back.
Reorganizing, reorg.
Right. So that's important. So we need to make sure that we do these things intentionally.
Thank you. Eric, actually, you now are in Denver, but you also worked for much of your career in Philadelphia, and I'm curious, we saw some of the graphs that Paul laid out for us that showed some big distinctions between, I think it was Philly was down there, right? And also Denver. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in both of those cities.
Absolutely. So prior to coming to Denver, I was in Philadelphia for a number of years, born and raised there, and actually in a neighborhood that was economically segregated in North Philadelphia, in the Latino community there. So coming to Denver and seeing the vast differences between the two communities, as captured in the research Paul did, it was fascinating to me. And it's something that really kind of structures both my personal and professional life. So when you think about Denver, it is a high growth city. Over the last 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, the city grew by 108,000 people. The city is, on an average basis, has 1,000 people per month coming to Denver. That has created a scenario where 31 of the 78 neighborhoods are vastly gentrifying, meaning they have tremendous investment, but they also have ever-increasing prices to rents, to home sales prices, and displacement, involuntary displacement of residents. That is in stark contrast to experiences in Philadelphia, where in Philadelphia you have areas of deep poverty, a poverty rate of over 26%. You have neighborhoods like the one I grew up in that did not have that investment and did not have that growth. And there's already separation that Paul had talked about of these neighborhoods. So there is some growth and prosperity in the center city area. So you have different tensions. In Denver, it's how do you balance the investments, the growth and the prosperity with ensuring affordability for residents across the entire income spectrum. While in Philadelphia, the tension there is how do you look at the investments that are occurring in small areas like Center City and push that out, as the mayor had talked about, to other neighborhoods. So it's two different tensions that are captured in that single graph that Paul had did between two different cities that are experiencing two different things. And so the underlying causes of it, of changes in the housing stock are similar, but the differentiates between the two really are captured in that graph and really can see from that experience.
And it seems like Denver now, because of the growth, you're also facing an affordability challenge, right? Can you talk a little bit about the trends, the dynamics, what that means for the city?
Absolutely. So in the city of Denver, over the last 5 years, 21,000 rental units have come online. This is a city where historically it has been a single-family detached housing stock. 72.8% of the housing stock is single-family detached. Now is it experiencing this density in the downtown and other surrounding areas in 31 of the 78 neighborhoods, as I had mentioned. But 80% of that housing stock that is coming online is at what we call the premium level, meaning it is 1-bedrooms and 2-bedroom apartments that are starting at $1,400 to $1,500. That is unaffordable to 49% of the population, which has an average household income of about $60,000. At that rate, they're paying well and above 30% of their income for the cost of housing alone. So the families who cannot afford to remain in these neighborhoods are now going out into the suburbs. And so another thing that Paul captures in the paper is that growing suburban poverty. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing now in Denver, where over just in the last 7 years, the number of families who come to the Denver Housing Authority, who are on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, up to 15% of them now end up returning the voucher because they cannot apply it in Denver, or they port out to an area city. So that change and that growth creates this strong tension, this current tension where we're seeing these neighborhoods begin to separate now. So where do we look at tools and investments to ensure that neighborhoods and families where these have been there historically for years can remain in their homes and be a part and have access to the growth and the prosperity that the city is experiencing.
Thank you. Well, and Michael, I'm curious because some of what both the mayor and Eric have talked about have racial implications, right? Have implications for people of color. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how race-based policies have, and again, the mayor touched on this, but if you can talk a little bit more about how race-based policies have affected so much of what we're seeing in terms of segregation. Economic segregation, excuse me.
It's one of my biggest frustrations right now because we seem to not want to acknowledge the elegant design of exclusion in this country. And we just want to skip over it now and just criminalize folks who are poor. Not have the cultural resilience to understand what has happened to even then want to even struggle with the problem that we're confronted with today. And then even when the world that many folks have created, it's become too toxic for them, they still don't want to deal with the underlying problems. So even in my own work, I'm at a real confounding place right now because the mayor early on talked about measuring. We can measure a lot, and we're spending a lot of time getting intoxicated by the problem that we knew we were creating. We intentionally designed it. So I don't know why we're so fascinated with it. We're exactly where we're supposed to be. And the sad part now is, you know, as I travel all around the countries, the mayors are busting their butts to try to reverse this cycle and continually run into the buzzsaw whenever they try to bring up race. It is the structural problem that really hampers their work because it's hard to talk about race and survive. And so when I think about public policy, race-based policy got us here. And now the appetite is to say, let's not be race-focused. So I don't understand how you do that when it got you here. But even more importantly than that, I don't understand how you can talk about measurement and analytics and then not want to own a population that is vulnerable and actually hold yourself accountable for moving forward on it in a big way. And so to me, that is our challenge right now, is to say, absolutely policy got us here, and absolutely we know some things that are working, we can call them out. But if we're not going to hold the interest of entire populations, we need to stop looking at the data. We need to stop talking about evidence. We need to stop talking about measurement, because we don't actually have the appetite to measure what matters. Imagine if you had a cultural survey that measured the appetite of all those institutions that the mayor is describing won't hire folks who have done the hard work of getting ready to be hired. Imagine what would happen. Imagine if you looked at institutions and said, on an equity index, how are they performing? And how are we going to hold them accountable for not being oppressive, but for liberating folks? So as I'm listening, you know, I'm frustrated because on one hand, I see all around the country mayors doing amazing work. And it's not at a scale statistically significant enough to move the population level needle. And that is frustrating because it's not like they're not trying. And what they need is more of us to give them the air cover, to give the elected officials the air cover they need to implement equity-focused transformative policy. And when you often discover what's the barrier to that, it is this wicked problem of folks thinking that somehow folks of color are undeserving. And in the context of policy, in a cultural context where you feel as somehow this group of others don't even deserve to exist here, I don't know how we chart a path forward. So I'm sharing that insight to tell you that that's the world I live in every day. It is a challenging world, but I'm excited because of what I see across the country. I own race because I have to own it. I own it because I have to. I can't solve these problems without owning it, and I would invite you all to think about how can you boldly own it as well. But I also, challenge you to think about if you get intoxicated by the data, if you get intoxicated by measurement and all this analytics out here, ask yourself, are you willing to measure the folks living at 200% of poverty and their liberation up out of it? Because that's where I don't see us applying all of our deep tools, all of the skill that we have. You think about all the student loan debt in this room right now. We're too damn smart to be so afraid of owning the people who need us to own them right now. Because here's the last thing I'll say, because what I know about race right now, I just watched an election where somebody was not afraid to own his people. I'm gonna say that once again. I watched an election where someone was not afraid to own his people. Why are we afraid to own ours? I don't know how to make this nice and rosy for you, because the work right now is to not to be just nice and rosy. It is to speak the truth to what people living at 200% of poverty and others need right now. And they need us to dismantle these systems of oppression. They need us to do our jobs. We're sitting in some privileged places, and we're playing around, hiding behind data, hiding behind analytics. And we need to get our head and our hearts and our fight in this game, folks. Otherwise, we're losing it. We're losing it. And we're losing it because our actions are not commensurate with the scale of the problem. So that's what race has to do with it. It's why I'm here. It's why I'm sitting on this stage today and my sisters are still in poverty. Opportunity is still too random in this country, and we're better than that. We're a better nation than that. So, to me, my best advice around this issue about race is to actually own the context. We don't have to beat each other up about it, but own the context. And then ask yourself, if a nation has intentionally been methodical at being results-based leaders at oppressing folks, how long does it take to bend that curve in the other direction? See, that's the research I haven't seen. Folks just keep saying they want it to be over tomorrow. But we've been results-based leaders at stripping wealth, oppressing folks, and denying opportunity based on race-based policy. So the next time you want to say, just be colorblind, I want you to ask yourself, how do you do that? And move the numbers for the folks who are hurting right now, because they do have color. And the sad part is now, even if you're white in that nice Newark and Denver, it's become too toxic for you to live there, because now you have to make a choice. If you've got a family, you can't use that public school because that public infrastructure is too toxic. You've got to make a choice between rent or mortgage and private school. Think about that for a second. All that indifference now has created a world that is too toxic for most of us to even enjoy. So this is our moment to decide what we want to do. Race does matter. Place does matter. The mayors are leading this nation and showing us a path forward. We need to join them and give them the air cover that they need to enact policies that will transform the lives of what I call the 100 million living at 200% of poverty in America.
Michael, let me follow up. That was like amazing, so thank you. Just incredible. So I work for the Center for Community Change, and we are all about increasing the voice and having people, particularly low-income communities, people of color, having a voice. And in this discussion, where is the voice of the people that are affected? How can we all, as advocates, lobbyists, policymakers, pave the way so that we can actually hear from the people affected and that they can have agency?
Well, you heard me start by saying who I care about. That's why I said the 100 million at 200% of poverty. When I walk into a room, that's who I care about. Just like some folks walk in a room and say they care about corporations. I care about the 100 million living at 200% of poverty. Do you know who you care about? Not generally speaking. but do you know who you care about? And when you walk into particular rooms, whether it's the White House or our boardroom or our community center, can you stand there with a straight spine and represent that interest unwaveringly? That's the question. People always ask, is voice there? Voice is always around. The question is, are you looking for it? I hear it every day because I care about hearing it. I care about finding it. And it shows up in subtle ways. It's like when we have this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and folks say, I just can't find those people. It's bullshit. You can find them if you wanted to, if you were focused on it. And what I'm asking you to think about, folks, is to stop letting yourself talk about accountability on one hand when it doesn't matter, but then when it comes time to take action, model work avoidance to the hilt. And this is an example. Many of us don't bring the voice of the folks struggling into the room with the veracity that we need to, because there's a sanction often when you do. You lose your job, you become marginalized, people will just say, oh, there goes Michael again talking about that. But that's the work. And that's what we signed up for. So if you don't want to get hit, you should probably not be in this profession. Because that's what matters. So for me, finding voice is not this exotic thing. It is a journey that we all have to be on to call out your population and know that that's why I'm walking into that room. That's why I'm privileged to be on the stage, to help those folks out that didn't get to sit here. Now that's my journey. I can't tell you how to find your own, but we're not going to solve this problem if you keep getting in rooms and you're afraid to say what people need. If you're afraid to call out race, if you're afraid to call out these structural barriers. So start by thinking about how do you own your population, really hear what they need from you to represent them, and then say that in your walkabout every day.
I'm curious, Mr. Mayor and Eric, who both work in cities that are clearly seeing and have seen racial shifts, both on the gentrification side, well, both of you on the gentrification side. How do you react to what Michael is saying? What's your insight from sort of the perspective of dealing with it?
I say right on. But you know, the reality is, like, so it's not just the fact that we should be interested in this because it's the socially and morally correct thing to do, and it is, and we've been fighting this fight hundreds of years. But it's also, we're at a point in America now where it's a tipping point. So you're either going to solve inequality and deal with race, or the country is going to continue to go down and down and down and down. This tax plan, for example, is an example of complete ignorance of the demographic, economically, politically, and socially in this country of what's happening, right? And so we either can go that way into oblivion, or we can move the country forward. Look, by the year 2020, and PolicyLink put this out, the majority of Americans under the age of 18 are going to be people of color, right? So, soon thereafter that, the majority of the population are going to be people of color. I mean, and that's just the reality. Maybe it explains a lot of the anxiety that's going on nationally, but that's just the reality. Like, it's not like made up by people who, just support, black and brown folks. That's the science. Right? Science says this is where we're going, that most Americans will be identifying themselves as people of color or of mixed origin. And it's important for us, especially since we have purposefully and deliberately isolated, millions and millions of Americans based on that, and have not put them into the economy, put them into the labor market, allowed them to be productive, allowed them to be innovative, allowed them to be imaginative, and move the economy forward. We're actually penalizing the entire country simply because we want to be racist. And that is a serious sickness, right? And then there are people who are apologetic for those folks who will not say what needs to be said, and they would continuously have high all of these student loans because they're afraid if we fix student loans, some black and brown people are going to benefit. We don't want to give people health care because we're afraid that poor black and brown people are going to benefit like the rest of the world. We don't want to fix transportation like the rest of the world because we're afraid that black and brown people are going to benefit, right? We don't want to do all the things that we know all Americans will benefit from because some black and brown kids may benefit from it at the same time. When we throw race in the garbage, the country moves forward. It's just that simple to me.
I think, yeah, building on what the mayor said, when you think about gentrification, the underlying cause of it is an issue of race and class. And that's a difficult conversation. Part of what the research captures is you see the growth of economic segregation with parallel to the growth of Latino and black communities in these cities. So when we talk about the investments that are happening in Denver, in a city that has 2.3% unemployment rate and 90% workforce participation rate, that's the opposite in Philadelphia. But the connecting issue is that those who have access to prosperity and growth are traditionally those minority communities. So when you think about this conversation of gentrification, and recently we had an incident in Denver that was covered in the New York Times and in the San Francisco Chronicle of a business in one of our vastly changing neighborhoods, a historically black neighborhood called 5 Points. A business put out a sign. The sign said, "Happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2014." And that really brought this conversation, this difficult conversation of race and class to a fever point, where the mayor said, well, it's time to lean in on this conversation because we gotta have the difficult conversations that race and class are so intimately entwined, particularly within our urban centers and within our cities. And that in order to look at pathways to opportunity and prosperity, we have to make sure that that is shared across these communities.
Right.
And that is a challenge. And that is where, in many respects, we do need to lean in. We do need cover. As a representative who goes to a lot of these community meetings and takes a lot of the arrows of this difficult conversation, that is what needs to happen in order to ensure that we can apply sort of the research and data that's being collected now to say, what does that mean now for policy?
Thank you, Eric. Senator Mikulski, the mayor talked a little bit about the tax plan making its way through Congress. And so I'm curious your thoughts on two things. One is this tax plan seems to have really wide-ranging implications. And if you can talk a little bit about that, particularly as it relates to one of your main areas of concern, which is this idea of zip code determinism. And if you can talk about there seems to be a link there and implications for one over the other, if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, certainly, thank you very much. And this has already been a very enlightening, educational, and I think inspirational panel. I'm happy to be a part of it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Barbara Mikulski. I served in the United States Senate for over 30 years. I started out my career, I'm a professionally trained social worker. I never thought I'd go into politics. But the powers that be didn't listen to the people. And while I was busy fighting the war on poverty so many years ago, they were going to run a 16-lane highway, pretty much where you are now. And it was going to destroy the older European ethnic neighborhoods, the Little Italys, the Polish Hills, the Greek towns, and the first black home ownership neighborhood in Baltimore, called Rosemont. Baltimore was a segregated town then, and it's kind of resegregated itself economically over and over again. I helped organize the fight against the expressway, and that protest took me to the city council, which took me to the House of Representatives, which took me to the Senate. Had the politicians listened to the people about our fight, which was not about a highway. We didn't give a damn about a highway. We cared about saving our neighborhoods.
Right.
That we were so hard fought to buy, to own, and they were more like urban villages. I wouldn't have been here. Of course, I wouldn't have been here without the First Amendment either, that allowed me to be a protester. So this whole listening, as you've so clearly said, is important. But it goes to the point, though, that I also wanted to raise in the discussion. A couple of takeaways. Number one, it's a term that I'm using, and you're free to use it if you so wish to embrace. It's called zip code determinism. For the first time in our country, or maybe the first time that's measured, is that the zip code you live in is more determinative of your life expectancy and your life outcome, but your life expectancy, than your genetic code. The zip code you're born in will be more determinative of your life expectancy in the United States of America, the 21st century, than your genetic code. So let's take Baltimore. So let's take 3 neighborhoods. Patterson Park, which used to be the older European ethnic neighborhood where I was born, that's now gentrifying itself. Compare that to another neighborhood called Harlem Park. The name Harlem Park speaks for itself, but it was once lower middle class, clerical service industry, the railroad unionized worker that we're all familiar with. And then another neighborhood called Roland Park, which is where the doctors, lawyers, Hopkins faculty, and all live. The life expectancy, the difference between Harlem Park and Roland Park, controlling for violence, is 20 years.
Wow.
So a woman growing up in that zip code, the hard work of getting educations and so on, will probably make it to her early 60s, maybe some beyond. But if you grow up in Roland Park, you're going to make it to your 80s. That is incredible. And the zip code determinism is not only about access, but all the things that affect access. So we in government, particularly when we did a bold thing like Obamacare, when we adopted a Republican idea like No Child Behind, the universal access to a highly qualified teacher solve all problems. I believe in universal access to highly qualified teachers. But what do you do when a child is subjected to so much violence around their neighborhood that they do their homework in a bathtub in their own home because the bathroom is the safest place in the house? And sitting in a bathtub doing your little reading or trying to do your little math, you're surrounded by the moat of a bathtub. So you tell me that doesn't affect you and the chronic stress? So you can have the best teacher in the world. You could have access then under Obamacare to the best doctors, the Johns Hopkins doctors, the University of Maryland doctors. But if you can't buy the food to be in a diabetic compliance, if you have to take 3 buses to see that specialist or that PT and so on, so that universal access is absolutely threshold. So we need universal access, but let's not kid ourselves that access solves all problems. And when we talk about a zip code determinism, it goes to what others in the panel said. We have to know who we are and own what we are becoming. Who we are and what we're becoming. So as we talk about federal policy, one of the most important things coming up in 2020 will be the census. If we don't take the census right, and if we don't get it right, we are cooked for a decade. Because look at where the federal funds come from. Let's go to, even if they are available, they come primarily in formulas. You had this great group, the 21st Century Cities, that came out of part of the Baltimore uprising. Ben Siegel came here with then Secretary Perez, our Secretary of Labor, to try to help us. When we had our uprising, even with the full commitment of the White House, Valerie Jarrett taking personal charge to work with the Maryland delegation to get resources here, we were hamstrung because money comes from formulas, or they come from categorical programs or grants that are Spartan and skimpy. So formula funds are going to determine a lot about what happens to us. in community development block grant, and so on. So no, we have to get ready for the census. This Friday, and now I speak as the former chair of the Appropriations Committee, this Friday, the continuing resolution expires. Remember, Congress was supposed to pass the 2019 appropriations. It extended it until December 8th. They have to make a decision. I believe they'll extend it for 2 more weeks while they sort it out. An overlooked program will be the funding of the census. You want the census funded, and you want to get ready to take the census. Because even if the money's there, we have to be able to, under the constitutional mandate, to take a census. Everybody counts, and everybody counts, and everybody should be counted. But don't forget, we want to count the homeless. We want to count the undocumented. We want to count those people that you spoke so eloquently about, where there are 3 families living in a household, but the lease says 1, and they're ready to lie about it to keep a roof over their head. So we need to be able to get ready for that. There'll be money to hire enumerators. Why can't we hire people from the community? But we've got to start now. You can't say, oh, wow, we've got to get ready, and then here it comes. You have to start now to make sure the money's there to take the census, and then to get ready on how you are going to take the census. Every mayor should have a task force thinking about it, planning with it, working with their academics to know how to reach it, and let's get ready. We will be able to hire enumerators. Don't see it only as a jobs program, see it as a future federal program. So I'm big on the census. Zip code determinism and so on. Now I want to talk about the Senate, in which I was a member for 30 years. The Senate is a rural institution. The Senate is a rural institution. And we have 6-year terms. So I tell you that it's a rural institution because as you go for funds, their big cities are usually their capitals. In states like us, the larger, particularly the coastal states, which are obviously in coastal states are in tremendous disfavor with this political dominance in Washington right this minute. You want to be able to have programs that also help rural communities as well as urban communities. Now, ironically, 2 of those came from Republicans. One was revenue sharing. Now, I'm a lot older than 99% of the people in this room. Revenue sharing was a program created by Richard Nixon. It was a formula-based fund that came to cities, and it enabled mayors to have the flexibility to know what to do to be able to help their communities. It could be physical infrastructure, like water and sewer, or it could be human infrastructure, like helping deliver Meals on Wheels. That ended under Ronald Reagan. And it ended under Ronald Reagan because they had to pay for Ronald Reagan's tax cut. Sound familiar? Then the other was under Gerald Ford, community development block grant money. I don't know how the mayors felt here, but as a member of Congress and a former member of the City Council, you could use community development block grant money to fight blight, affordable housing, infrastructure development, and so on, and it was largely at your discretion. The great thing about community development block grant money, again, it was formula-based that came to rural or semi-rural areas in the same way that it came to urban. You want those kinds of programs. While we're looking at the rural, we're looking at targeted programs, categorical that would help cities, sure, go for it. But I'm telling you, the likelihood of getting political support is one that will help others and also be able to help with rural poverty. And having represented rural poor communities. It is really tough. And that's where the coalition lies. And it would shock everybody because it breaks the race barrier in a just chip. It doesn't break, it chips away at it because it's common cause to be able to help. So that's that. Now with this tax bill, what a dog. But it's a dog that will bite the wrong people. The tax code really doesn't help many people. Even the so-called, it's going to unleash the economic power of the United States and we're going to be great again, and yeah. The fact is that it creates the deficit. I mean, it enlarges the deficit. We already have a deficit. But it enlarges it to such a catastrophic level that they will have to go after programs. The first programs on the chopping block that has already been announced are so-called entitlements, and it'll be Medicaid. You go after Medicaid, and because they voted to eliminate the individual health insurance mandate, it is the unraveling of Obamacare. You eliminate the individual mandate, it will destabilize the insurance market, the beginning on, and then it goes after Medicaid. 80% of the people on Medicaid are children. 80% of the people on Medicaid are children. 80% of the money goes to people in long-term care who have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and cannot be kept at home. That's where they're going to go, and it will affect children, reinforcing zip code determinism. And then they're going to go after the categorical kinds of programs. And you know what they'll go after. We can talk about the agencies. They begin with H, HUD, Health and Human Resources, the Department of Education. Well, that's not an H, etc. And there will be the disinvestment, the further disinvestment of the federal government in meeting the needs of its people, because we will have to pay the interest on the debt and so on. And while all this is going on, despite the great efforts of mayors and local governments and even some elements in our private sector, the coming dawn of artificial intelligence is something we really need to think about. And we are in no way getting ready for that. Just a quick line, and then I'm done here, finish this part. When Bethlehem Steel closed here, and it was our major manufacturing employer, and it had been around for almost 100 years. It closed because Mr. Wilbur Ross, our Secretary of Commerce, who's busy unleashing the power of our economy, closed through Bethlehem Steel into bankruptcy and the pension plan into pension guarantee. My steel workers lost 30% of their pension, like that. Many of those people who worked there went to work in e-commerce. They became drivers for FedEx. They became workers where we had a General Motors plant that also closed. Amazon opened a distribution center. 1,000 people are working there. We're thrilled, okay? Well, those jobs are going to be automated. Where people went, they're going to be automated. This self-driving car that everybody's so excited about, cool and groovy, those drivers are going to be eliminated. The pipeline of e-commerce will become more and more automated. The innovation economy is shrinking. I could go on about it. We have so much that lies ahead that we have to really marshal our forces, but we have to start with the zip code that you're born in determines your life, and we have to have zip code action. So I believe we got to get off the benches, into the trenches, and back on the barricades.
And Senator, you laid out for us some really good areas that we need to look at the federal level for solutions. And I'm curious at the local level, for example, Mayor Baraka, if you can talk a little bit about what policy areas you are looking at, especially as you are dealing with what might be competing populations coming into the, either living in the city or coming into the city.
As I said earlier, most of the kind of legislation we're working on the local level is about, a kind of economic inclusiveness as the city develops. How do we provide housing for everyone? How do we make sure everybody has opportunity for housing? How do we create jobs or make sure that jobs are going to all of our residents? We are, working with the universities to create policy around making sure that they target Newark residents to the university. For example, Rutgers University in the last 3 years has increased its enrollment of Newark students by 60%, right? And that's because of NCLC, Newark City Learning Collaborative, where we have organized all of the presidents of the universities to begin to create very deliberate pipelines of students from the high school to the university, and actually building dormitories specifically targeting Newark residents, right? So that's where we're going. Now, the next piece of that, and that helps us to tell the corporations, listen, when we get these kids to college, when they graduate, they need jobs. And so we need to make sure that they can work at the jobs that you have. And what's interesting about these cities is that there is no lack of, Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies, they're all here. I'm sure they're all in Baltimore. They're definitely in Newark, from United Airlines to Prudential to Panasonic, to Amazon, which is a subsidiary of Audible. They're all there. We have to get them to hire Newark residents and to invest in Newark businesses, right? And if the city is going to give you abatements to develop, if you're going to get subsidies to develop in the city, that subsidy has to come at a cost. You have to reinvest in our community. You have to have minority co-developers on your projects. You have to take some of that money that you're going to save and invest it in the communities where you're building. And these are the kind of policies, and on a state level, we're trying to force the governor, the new governor, thank God, to, we should have a prayer in here, right? Thank God for that, that when they give these corporations money to come into the state, that they have requisites for employment, that have requisites for investment, and all of the pension dollars and the rest of the money that they invest in these financial institutions that are outside of the state of New Jersey, that invest outside of the state of New Jersey, that they can no longer do that. They have to begin to get them to invest in the state, to invest in employment, to invest in the most distressed neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are fighting the most to stay alive, to stay afloat. The state has to invest in those neighborhoods. And the irony of that is that those are the same neighborhoods that are going to help the state to move forward economically. And if what King said, if it's not more important now than it's ever been, is that our fates are inextricably tied to one another. That God has a sense of humor, that the least amongst us will be the ones that'll help the country begin to explode into its future.
Do you have any partnerships with the suburbs? As Michael was talking about folks moving out of cities, and we're seeing more poverty, for example, in suburban areas. What has that meant in terms of relationships between, for example, your city and the suburbs?
Well, there are a lot of people who are trying to move away from the suburbs. That's number one. But it does, what is happening is that, now that the trend is reversed, we want this European model where the cities are the place where rich folks live and everybody else lives in the outskirts. So what's happening is they're taking these vouchers and they're forcing people to take the vouchers outside of the city to go into suburban communities, close but not too far. I mean, far but not too close to the cities. And they're using those vouchers in those areas. And what's happening is that with those vouchers out there are not working as well as they would work in the city, because you don't have access to the same kind of things that you had in the city. So the vouchers become less and less useful. And there are more people who are paying, as I was talking to brother here, more people who are paying their income on housing. So all of this is affecting. So right now in New York City and Manhattan, they have a majority of their units are not being filled up. So even the affordable units in New York and Manhattan are about $3,000 or $3,500, right? Which is ridiculous, right? So people can't live in Manhattan. So by virtue of the market, they're moving out to the suburban parts of, or the outer boroughs. And then, so we're included in those outer boroughs, right? Newark, Jersey City, Hoboken, we're included in those outer boroughs. And once Jersey City is filled and Hoboken is filled and West New York, they come to Newark. And that's how we're affected. So they come into Newark, and so a unit in Newark, which is market rate at $2,000, $2,500, is affordable to those folks, but not affordable to people who've been there for a very long time. So we have to be able to kind of create policy that intervenes in that makes sure that we accept people that come from other places, but create opportunities for people who've been here for a long time.
And because Eric, now you're dealing with some similar issues in that sense, right? And it looks like Denver is moving with the Office of Hope as one way of trying to address that. If you can talk a little bit about that. It's the Housing and Opportunity for People Everywhere office, right?
Yes, so this office was created after the city council and the mayor established a $150 million affordable housing fund. That sounds like a lot, but in a city that has a housing real estate value of $1 billion, that impact is minimal. So where are we looking for opportunities to best innovate and leverage those dollars? One of those is through a program that we had announced a couple of months ago called the Lower Income Voucher Equity Program, where we're taking $1 million of the dollars from the Affordable Housing Fund. We brought foundations and some of our bigger employers to the table and said, let's create a collective fund where we can then provide to workforce families at 40%, which is a family of four at about $34,000, up to 80% of area median income, which is a family of four at about $67,000, and buy down the cost of the rents. You know, one of the interesting things within the growth of the rental market within Denver is that now, since the majority of that stock that was built over the last 5 years, you're talking 20,000 units, now the vacancy rate is increasing at the very high level because they overbuilt to the highest level. Right. You know, the 1,000 people a month coming to the city, 800 of them can't afford that, 200 of them can. So where do we buy down the cost of those rents and keep working families in Denver? And one of the reasons we have to push for this affordable housing fund is, and I'll add to some of the fear of the tax reform plan, is that the House passed bill for tax reform guts some of the workforce programs of affordable housing. It eliminates what we call tax-exempt bonds, which is the primary workhorse of 4% low-income housing tax credits.
That's right.
Which has created millions of units throughout the country. 3,000 alone here in Denver. Nearly 4,000 in Philadelphia. So when we think about that reduction and losing that program, cities are now going to have to step up with our own funding sources and look for innovative ways to best leverage our dollars with employers and with foundations, like we're trying to do through our Live Denver program. And so my office was created to say, how do we bring together all of these investments and funnel it up so that way we can make a more strategic investment into our affordable housing needs throughout the city.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. I think we're going to do a little Q&A for folks before we get to maybe some final thoughts from everyone on the panel. So we'll open it up, and if folks have questions, I think we have some folks with microphones around.
Yeah, it's going to be serious.
Hi, I'm Oscar Bello at Next City. I wanted to ask you, Senator, about, you brought up community development block grants, and tell me if I'm wrong. The funding for entitlement communities peaked in 1994 and has gone down pretty much every year since. At the same time, entitlement communities are going up, so we were fighting after shrinking slices of a shrinking pie. Right. It sounds like you sort of have a bit of a game plan for how to maybe reverse that, and I'm wondering, well, you know, what happened? You know, why is it going down every year, and how can we try to reverse that? What are the folks? Are we doing things wrong in the media, in among mayors?
What program are you talking about?
Community development block grants.
Well, the community development block grant program. First of all, well, there are many reasons, but I think one is just advocacy. People don't understand it because it's not like. It doesn't, like if you say health care for the homeless, you know where it's going, or homeless, etc. So I believe that, one, by and large, the block grant programs do not have necessarily the strongest advocacy. They're taken for granted. Those of us who are from the areas that support it do find that. But you need a stronger advocacy on what does it mean. There are 6 categorical areas that you can use CDBG for. And then if you highlight not something called the program, nobody lives or dies for a program. They live or die for the outcome of the program. Right. And that's the story that you need to tell. You need to stay it locally. And I want to talk about working with Congress. Everybody says, let's run to Washington and talk to our legislator. That is the worst time to talk to us. We are so busy. We go from one committee hearing to another, our voting schedule, etc. The time for us to have conversations are when we are at home. We're at home on weekends. The Senate takes out 1 week a month where they're supposed to be in their state, and most are. You want to, through your leadership or a consortium of the people from the community as well as the political leaders, etc., to talk about the outcome of the programs. What is your vacant house program? What are you doing to fight blight? How does this tie in with popular charities like Meals on Wheels, where you're keeping elderly out of long-term care, thus helping contain the Medicaid costs? You've got to tell your story about what's happening at the local level and what does it mean for people. And when we advocate, for those of us who advocate on your behalf, is we're going to tell those stories over and over again. So when we're going to say, when I was in Cincinnati and I visited, you know, the arts program that they're doing in this community, where we once had these vacant houses, this is what gets it going. But when you want to talk to members of Congress, you want to, whether it's the House or the Senate, you want to try to get on their schedule for when they're coming to the district or the state. And I tell you, it's very powerful. And for me, it was some of the most inspirational moments. It is really tough to be a fighter and to want to do a good job. But when you think back to the people that you meet, the stories you hear, the children you know you've helped empower, the elderly you've helped stay in their own home, man, does that get you revved up to do more and to do better. So that's an observation I'd like to share with you.
Great, other questions? And please tell us your name and your organization.
I'm Derek Hamilton. I'm a faculty member from the New School in New York. And my question is with regards to neighborhoods and its impact on social determinants. The evidence is compelling, but I wonder, as the Mayor Baraka alluded to earlier, has neighborhood become a euphemism for race? Is it really race underlying these attributes, and we're being euphemistic and not hitting it head on by calling it race? And the last thing I'll just mention is the new research by Case and Deaton looking at an increase in the mortality rates among certain segments of the white population. Well, that research is demonstrating that it's not neighborhood specific, that if you fit that category, it's geographically dispersed. So again, I wonder, and by the way, even that research, the mortality rates, although rising for that segment of the white population, is still much lower than that of black population. So again, are we avoiding talking about race?
Yes.
Who would like to take that?
Man.
Michael?
Well, I just from a perspective of when you look at economic segregation, at least a third of it is just strictly a function of racial segregation. Because two groups are unequal and you segregate them, then the neighborhoods of one group are going to be poorer than the other. So it's about 30% nationally of all economic segregation is just racial segregation. But then there's also economic segregation within the white community and within the black community that then sort of adds the remaining amount. So I think that yes, we definitely want to look at both of those issues, because to some extent, the exclusion based on racial segregation, which was the motivation for creating the system of economic segregation, has direct consequences in terms of excluding people of color from the good schools, from the good of resources, from the public amenities that white children have enjoyed. And even when you look at, in recent years, there has been some slight decline in racial segregation, not nearly enough, and some cities are still basically completely segregated, particularly cities where black people happen to live in large numbers. But there has been some progress. And so to the extent that there's more economic segregation over time, it's not because racial segregation is increasing. In addition to racial segregation, which is still there and is still a huge problem, we have this additional factor of how we're building neighborhoods so that people can sort out by income. And they use two things interact, and we can't just look at one or the other. We have to look at both.
Michael, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's right. I do. Like I said, I think a lot of the places that I travel, when we're trying to solve problems, the issue of race and class, we don't want to bring those into the room, and we need to. I think it's essential. And so that's why I try to use the discipline of talking about the population to get us into that, and then using the data. If I get into a data conversation with you, I'm going to be in an equity conversation if we disaggregate it, right? And start trying to craft strategy based on what we're seeing in those numbers. And so to me, if you're doing that and bringing that discipline, you're going to be talking about race, class, and a host of other intersectionalities. The ultimate question becomes, do we have the commitment to do something about it, ultimately?
Other questions?
Yeah, this is Khan for the city of San Jose. So 2 questions. One, we are My Brother's Keeper city, and that has given us kind of the framework for how to talk about race. It has been exciting because our city, department leaders and city managers didn't have a space to talk about institutionalized racism, right? Or that they want to be called racist, or that our policy doesn't allow us to even collect data based on race and gender. So it allowed us to desegregate that. And my question is, what other strategies do you have to create a space to have those conversations, right? Because no one intentionally is trying to be racist or even know that they are being racist. Sure. But how do you have that conversation with department heads who are running our Mayor's Gangs Task Force programs and our library programs and our after-school programs? The second question is for the senator. I think that you talked about the impact of automation and robotics to the future workforce. And I guess my question is, what can we do today to meet current industry demands? For example, we know that there's 1 million cybersecurity jobs that are unfulfilled today. What can we do now?
Do you really believe that? I'm not challenging you. Please don't misunderstand me. But I know here first of all, Maryland is the epicenter of national security, cybersecurity. We're the home to the National Security Agency, and it employs more people than Bethlehem Steel did in its heyday. Yes, because it's a 3-shift, because those who hate us work in different time zones. But if we're looking at cybersecurity, what is it we're looking at? And my observation is that many companies don't want to hire people with a community college degree, and for many in our community, the community college or those who've just come out of the military that are getting a community college background are not being hired. So it's not going to be the sophisticated mathematician working on algorithms. It's going to be the people working on bank security. What are you going to do about it? And what is going to be the role of the community college in all of this? But I want to backtrack to Amazon here in Maryland. First of all, when General Motors closed on Broning Highway, they had run their useful life and we'd help keep it going. So now we have an Amazon distribution center, and it is primarily robotic, even though they employ a lot of people. To move up, if you go to the Baltimore Community College and take their robotics program, they're standing in line to hire you. There is a vacancy for students at the program because in order to take the program at the community college, you have to have algebra. Many of the kids haven't taken algebra, they're algebra phobic, any number of reasons, or to quote one of the things I believe George Bush said, the soft bigotry of low expectations. So many of our boys and girls are not going to get into the programs because we don't We're not back helping them get ready. I think one of the great success programs in Baltimore has been the Algebra Project. Small, but nevertheless effective. And then for the kids that go into the robotics program in our community college, they're now making $75,000 a year and moving into management. If you didn't take algebra, you're not in the robotics program, and you're not sure if you'll be a driver hired on at Christmas time to deliver packages where you'll be replaced by a drone in 5 years.
Great. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We have do you have a microphone? Okay, we have a question up front, and we have another question in the back.
Maybe I have that.
Oh, great. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Is this thing on? Is it on? Yeah. Great. Hi, Charlie Duff from Baltimore. I'm starting now to hear a lot of talk about how the suburbanization of poverty might be a bad thing for poor people. And this is really new, because for all my life, advocates for the poor have been trying to open up the suburbs so that poor people could get to them. And here in Baltimore, where the city of Baltimore is politically independent, it's not part of a county. We're entirely surrounded by a big county where the people have, on average, twice the income that we do, and their property's worth twice as much, and their taxes are half as low, and the schools are a lot better. And if you're a poor person in Baltimore City and you want your kids to go to good schools with middle-class kids sitting next to them, why shouldn't you want to be in Baltimore County? I'm just curious. This seems to be a big change. And, you know, in New York it's probably different, but most cities aren't New York.
Well, I think people don't have this aversion to want to be in the suburbs. They just want a better life. I mean, people believe that if they go to the suburbs that they're going to have access to wealth, opportunity, and all of these things simply by virtue of the fact that they live in the suburbs. What they don't know is that racism follows them to the suburbs as well, and that ultimately, you know, the way the economy is going, and what's being said is that the cities are becoming too expensive for people to live in, so they're being pushed out, and they're going to go to the suburbs not with more money. They're not going to the south suburbs with more wealth, and those are the things. So when the suburbs were subsidized by the United States government, subsidized when they gave out low interest loans that they're not giving to poor black and brown people to buy homes, to have more wealth in their pocket to be able to spend and invest and improve their lives, where they're not spending 40 to 60% of their income on housing itself, to be able to go into the middle class. That kind of dream doesn't exist today. So when people are going to the suburbs now, they're going with less money in their pocket, less opportunity, and less access. So they're almost stranded. And so when they go out there in these places, they don't have access to the things that they normally had access to, which is almost why, like, most homeless people hang out in the cities, because all of the programs exist in the city. They can't go hang out in the suburbs on the street without getting arrested, so they can come hang out. As the feeding programs, the social welfare programs, all the other things happen in the city. And what's interesting is that people say, oh, we want to get rid of these people out of the city, but they're coming because the programs exist there. So when people go to the suburbs, they believe in their mind, because this is how they were acculturated, that the suburbs are better. And they don't know that they were better because that's where people were taking their wealth. But when they go out there without the same wealth, they don't have the same kind of outcomes as the people who are there now with that wealth. So it becomes problematic still. So it is, if we do not address inequality, if we do not address income inequality, both economic and racially, in this country, just by moving to the suburbs is not going to fix the problem at all. You'll just have a bunch of poor people in the suburbs.
Without cars in places that are totally car dependent.
Yeah, that have to be dependent on cars with no public transportation to get around, and it gives them less access to employment in the first place, which is making it more difficult for families that move there.
One answer to your question is that, remember, Ferguson was a suburb.
Right.
And as recently as 1990, Ferguson was mostly white and low poverty. And what happened was that further out suburbs, richer outer ring suburbs, basically drained out the higher income population of Ferguson, and it filled in with people thinking they were moving to the suburbs and finding out that the suburb was basically in a state of collapse. And when a central city loses some of its higher income population, at least it still has hotels like this and convention centers and other sources of revenue that can sustain it. When a suburb is basically just about properties and property values, when that starts to lose that, it has nothing left. So some of those suburbs are actually much worse places to be than the Butterfly or other, sort of high poverty areas in the inner city. And part of it is, as you said, the availability of services, the availability of transportation, and the fact that there's still kind of a functioning government there that has a revenue base other than property taxes.
Thank you, Paul. We had one other question, one final question in the back.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Alec McGillis. I'm a reporter with ProPublica, Baltimore resident. I was just curious how you all see the gaps between cities fitting into this issue of gaps within cities. It seems like part of the problem is that you have, one reason you have such high gentrification pressures in sort of the winter cities that creates a certain kind of inequality, and then the abandonment problems in other cities that creates another kind of inequality, is that you have this growing gap between cities. We have much bigger gaps now between our sort of winner-take-all cities, the Seattles, Denvers, Boston, DCs, New York, San Francisco's, and then the kind of left-behind cities, like the St. Louis's and Cleveland's, Milwaukee's, Baltimore maybe, if you can argue the list, but those gaps are getting a lot bigger, and it seems like that's a big part of this issue is actually what's happening between cities. And I just wonder if how you all see that fitting into this.
Well, as someone who can speak to sort of experiences of both cities, and in Philadelphia, a historic Rust Belt Northeast city with lots of factory jobs, as the senator had touched on that loss, and then in Denver, where you're experiencing tremendous growth. I think it's an important part of the conversation, but what underlines and bridges the challenges between those two cities is that underneath of it, you still have this issue of where does wealth and where does race segregation come into it? And where do those investments, regardless of whether you're in a historic Rust Belt city in the Northeast, like Philadelphia, or in a high growth city like Denver, the issue remains the same. Because historically, as the mayor had talked about, when you look at HUD housing policy over the last 50 years, we had, particularly within the space of public housing, had a policy where we concentrated, highly concentrated poverty in particular buildings, not just neighborhoods, but in buildings. In Philadelphia, we had a neighborhood called Blumberg Apartments. It was 4 16-story towers housing nearly 2,000 people at 30% of income and below. That is highly concentrated poverty. Right. And part of what Hope 6 and eventually what became Choice Neighborhoods was to say, that didn't work. We need to look at the dignity of people who are there and create more mixed income communities to give them access to the opportunity and the growth within a city or the growth within a suburb, and look at ways in which that we can better integrate that policy. So what bridges the differences between a Denver and a Philadelphia is that underline it all is where do we set national housing policy that drives a lot of the investments, that impacts these communities like CDBG, like low-income housing tax credits, like a host of other investment programs to say, where do we ensure that those investments are not further segregating our communities, but instead bridging them and creating mixed income communities to allow all people to have access to prosperity and to jobs.
Great, thank you, Eric. We are at time, and I want to thank all of the panelists for really rich, fascinating discussion. Thank you.